He was chained, sold like property, stripped of his name. But this African boy would rise to become the first Black Anglican bishop in history. He would translate the Bible into African languages, educate thousands, challenge British racism, and shape modern Nigeria without ever firing a single bullet. This is not just a story of survival. This is the story of Ajayi Crowther, the man who outsmarted slavery and rewrote African history. Ajayi Crowther was born around 1809 in Oshogun, near present-day Iseyin, in what is now Oyo State, Nigeria. His birth name was Ajayi. He was Yoruba. He was African, and he was born free. This was a time when the Oyo Empire, though weakened, still carried the legacy of power, culture, and learning. Ajayi grew up speaking Yoruba, surrounded by oral history, proverbs, music, and deep spirituality. But history was about to break into his life, violently. When Ajayi was still a boy, his town was attacked by slave raiders. Fires burned. People screamed. Families were torn apart. Ajayi was captured, chained, and forced to march hundreds of kilometers toward the coast. He watched people die along the road. Those who fell were left behind. This was the African side of slavery, often erased from popular narratives. At the coast, Ajayi was packed into a slave ship bound for the Americas. But something extraordinary happened. Before the ship could reach the New World, it was intercepted by the British Royal Navy. Britain had officially abolished the slave trade in 1807, and its navy now patrolled the Atlantic. Not out of pure morality, but power and control. The ship was seized. The captives were freed. Ajayi was taken to Freetown, Sierra Leone, a settlement for liberated Africans. There, everything changed. In Sierra Leone, Ajayi was introduced to Christian missionaries. He learned to read. He learned to write. He learned English. He was baptized and given a new name, Samuel Crowther. This renaming symbolized both loss and opportunity. Loss of former identity, but access to education the colonial world had long denied Africans. Crowther proved exceptional. He mastered languages rapidly: Yoruba, English, Latin, Greek, and later Hausa and Igbo. Missionaries noticed something powerful. This African was not just learning Christianity. He was interpreting it through African intelligence. Crowther was sent to England for further studies. There, he shocked British scholars. At a time when Africans were considered inferior, Crowther debated theology, linguistics, and philosophy as an equal. He became a language genius. Crowther would go on to create the first Yoruba grammar book, translate the Bible into Yoruba, develop written forms for African languages. He proved something revolutionary. African languages were not primitive. African minds were not inferior. This alone shook the foundations of colonial racism. Crowther returned to West Africa, not in chains, but as a missionary and educator. He worked across Sierra Leone, Abeokuta, the Niger region. Crowther believed Africans must lead African Christianity, but this belief would put him on a collision course with European missionaries. When Ajayi Crowther returned to West Africa in the 1840s, he was not simply preaching Christianity, he was building systems. Crowther worked with the Church Missionary Society, CMS, and joined early expeditions along the River Niger, a region Europeans barely understood but desperately wanted to control. Crowther did something radical. Instead of imposing European customs, he preached in local languages, trained African teachers and clergy, encouraged African leadership within the church. He believed something revolutionary for the 19th century. Africa must be evangelized by Africans. This idea made sense to Africans. but it made many Europeans deeply uncomfortable. To them, Crowther was useful, but only up to a limit. In 1864, history was made. Samuel Ajayi Crowther was consecrated as the first African Anglican bishop in the world. This was unprecedented. For the first time, an African supervised Europeans within the church. It was a moment of pride for Black people globally, but it also triggered resentment. Despite his brilliance, Crowther faced constant sabotage. Not all European missionaries were sincere in their faith. Some Europeans accused him of incompetence. They questioned African leadership. They undermined his authority. Ironically, this happened after slavery was abolished. Crowther was pushed aside. His mission was taken from him. This reveals a hard truth. Slavery ended. Racism did not. By the 1860s, Samuel Ajayi Crowther had reached the height of his career. In 1864, he was consecrated as Bishop of the Niger Territory, the first Black Anglican bishop in history. But power changes relationships. As Crowther's influence grew, European resentment quietly grew with it. By the 1870s, the tone toward Crowther had changed. Some European missionaries, many younger, less experienced, and far less educated than Crowther, began to complain about him to the Church Missionary Society in London. Their accusations included weak supervision, poor discipline among African clergy, administrative inefficiency. But there was an unspoken accusation beneath all of this. An African should not be in charge of Europeans. When European missionaries failed, it was called logistical difficulty. When Africans failed, it was called racial incapacity. Crowther was judged by standards no European bishop could meet in the Niger's harsh conditions: disease, floods, long distances, and limited funding. Yet the CMS blamed him personally. In 1890, just 1 year before Crowther's death, the CMS sent a commission of inquiry to investigate the Niger mission. This commission questioned Crowther's leadership, interviewed missionaries who already opposed him, ignored decades of his achievements. The outcome was devastating. Crowther was stripped of real authority. European missionaries were placed over African clergy. The mission he built was quietly taken from him. This was not reform. This was institutional racism, executed politely on official letterhead. By this time, Crowther was old, tired, and deeply wounded. He had given his life to a church that ultimately did not trust Africans to lead themselves. Even worse, his own son, Dandison Coates Crowther, a brilliant clergyman, was also removed from leadership. This wasn't just professional humiliation. It was systematic erasure. Crowther had survived. Enslavement, the Atlantic slave trade, cultural displacement. But the deepest wound came after slavery ended, because freedom without equality is still oppression. Ajayi Crowther died in 1891, broken in spirit but not defeated. For decades, his contributions were minimized in British records. But Africa remembered. Nigeria remembered, because Crowther did something eternal. He preserved African languages, educated generations, and proved Africans could lead themselves. He died knowing that African leadership had been rolled back. His authority had been undermined. His vision was temporarily defeated. But history has a way of correcting itself. Later generations would acknowledge what the empire refused to admit. Crowther was not the problem. The system was. Today, historians widely agree that the Niger mission declined after Crowther was sidelined. The very man accused of weakness had been its strongest pillar. Without Crowther, Yoruba might not have been written early. African Christianity would lack indigenous roots. Nigerian education would have been delayed. Crowther represents something deeper: intellectual resistance, cultural survival, African excellence. He didn't fight with guns. He fought with knowledge. Ajayi Crowther was sold as a slave, but he rose as a bishop. History tried to silence him, but his words still speak. And today, as Africa reclaims its story, Crowther stands as proof that they can chain the body, but they can never chain the mind. If stories like this matter, if African history deserves its voice, subscribe to Echoes of the Ancients.